Hi guys, I want you to realize the level of dedication that's taking place for this video right this very second. Where am I? I'm in my car in the parking lot behind M Hall because this is the only fairly quiet space that I can get in order to make this video. I don't want to have to make it tonight and then it doesn't load, so I want to have the whole day to get it up. So if you hear like a weird rumbling noise, that is not my stomach, it's actually the car. So hopefully it's not too loud and not too distracting. But we're going to try to get this done as quick and possible as we can. So here we go. Plant nutrition. So I always like to start off with this picture, especially in the Caribbean. Animals, or animal waste in general, is used as some types of manure or nutrients for plants. And it's always found that the plants that have been treated with animal waste products actually are healthier, they bear more fruit, the fruit is sweeter, like they're just generally healthier than plants that have been given the artificial types of nutrients and manure and stuff. So I just think it's funny that dogs pee on trees, and that's a good thing, but trees don't pee on dogs. So over the years, we have gotten into the habit of thinking that plants just make food automatically because they are autotrophs and they do photosynthesis and it just happens. As long as we use sunlight, it happens. But that's not necessarily true. Just because you're autotrophic doesn't mean you're autonomous. It doesn't happen instantaneously out of thin air. There are some initial needs that a plant has to have in order for it to do photosynthesis. So sun or sunlight is very, very essential because that's our energy source. And then we also need inorganic compounds in the form of raw materials. So things like water and carbon dioxide and small amounts of minerals. Without all of these things, it's really, really hard for a plant to just do photosynthesis and make its own food. So the process isn't an automatic thing. There are some things that you have to input first. Feel free to pause if you need to. So this table goes over all of the essential things that a plant needs. It even breaks it down in terms of what some of those major functions are that the plant's going to use these micronutrients for. I don't require you to know everything on this table, but I do need you to know that other than just water and carbon dioxide, plants actually do need what we call micronutrients. So we call them micronutrients because the plant just needs a tiny bit, but it's things like chlorine and iron, magnesium, boron, zinc, copper, nickel. And then there are also some things that the plant would utilize for enzyme function, because just like us, they have enzymes as well. Now, if you're like me and your plants die constantly, or they look like they're going through lots of pain before they actually die, because I have no green thumb whatsoever, then some of these pictures may not look all that abnormal to you. My plants frequently look like these three down here, because I suck at taking care of green things. But anyway, when plants lack essential nutrients, just like when we don't have things that our body needs, we get sick, or we can't do certain things well, like we can't grow taller, or we can't grow long hair, or our skin looks weird. It's the same thing for a plant. When they're missing certain key nutrients, they exhibit very specific symptoms. And we normally see those symptoms in coloration of their leaves, like their leaves aren't a nice, healthy green color anymore. We'll even look at the size of the leaves. They grow smaller, or they're curled up, or they just appear deformed. So what you're going to see on the outside, what that plant is going to exhibit, depends on the function of that initial nutrient. And it also depends on the solubility of the nutrient. So there's some nutrients that plants can't take a lot of because they need to dissolve in water, and they don't do that well, so the plant needs more of those things. And there's some that dissolve almost too well, and the plant gets way more of it than they need. So here's an example. This is what our healthy plant looks like. Nice green leaf, shiny, all that good stuff. This one, where it has that purple to pinkish strip on the outside, shows that this plant is phosphate deficient. Whereas where that pink strip now becomes more like an orange or yellow strip, but it's still on the outside, it shows that that plant is potassium deficient. When that orange or yellow strip moves to the inner portion of the leaf, it shows that the plant is nitrogen deficient. So just some examples of how plants can exhibit the need for certain types of nutrients. A major deficiency in the case of magnesium is going to result in a condition called chlorosis, which is the yellowing of that plant's leaves. So if you look at it, this is our nice healthy plant, lots of leaves, green foliage, good size leaves. And then this is how the plant appears over time as that condition starts to take place. So why does the plant not having magnesium affect the ability of its leaves to be that nice green color that attracts sunlight and allows the plant to do photosynthesis? Because of course a plant with yellow leaves isn't going to do photosynthesis as effectively as a plant with green leaves. So through much experimentation, it was discovered that magnesium is actually a major part in the chlorophyll molecule, both chlorophyll A and B, which gives plants that characteristic green color. So if you look at this part of the diagram, this is the molecular structure of chlorophyll. And right in the center, right in the middle where my laser is, there is a magnesium ring. So when magnesium is not available, then chlorophyll itself breaks down. This ring kind of holds the entire structure together. So with no chlorophyll, there's no or very little photosynthesis taking place. Ironically enough, or interestingly enough, the condition tends to show up in the older leaves first, because what the plant is going to do is any available magnesium is going to be shuttled to the younger leaves, because those leaves have a longer time to grow. Chances are that they'll be able to do photosynthesis for a little bit longer, whereas the older leaves are probably almost at the end of their lifespan. They're about to be shed, and they won't be utilized anyway. So it's kind of like a self-preservation mechanism that the plant has. Now, because a plant grows primarily in soil, it is very dependent on the quality of that soil. So how nutrient rich the soil is going to be directly proportional to how healthy and fertile and rich the plant itself is. So soil quality depends on a couple of things. You have to think of things like texture and structure. What size are the soil particles? What types of particles are there? Is it clay? Is it sand? Because some soils are better suited for certain purposes. Like sand, for example, doesn't hold water very well. So you will have to water plants that grow in sandy soils way more frequently than you would water plants that grow in like clay soils, for example. Clay soils tend to hold water a lot better. Then you also have to think of composition. How much of that soil is made up of organic and inorganic components or chemical components? How fertile is the soil? Does it have a good top layer? Is that top layer rich in the nutrients that the plant needs? And different plants have different nutritional needs. So of everything that a plant grows in, the topsoil is the most important layer, specifically to plant growth. It's the region that's going to be rich in organic matter, and that organic matter is called humus, and it's made up of decomposing organic material. So dead organisms, animal waste products, fallen leaves or seeds or fruit or whatever. And they're all recycled and reused by bacteria and fungi. So over time, as these different parts and pieces break down, it helps to improve the soil texture, and it becomes a reservoir for some of those micronutrients that we talked about a couple of slides ago. So for people who compost, I'm not sure how popular composting is here, but if your parents or your mom especially likes to garden and she talks about her plants not growing as well as they should, you could talk to her about composting, where you would take some of your scraps from your kitchen, like when she peels potatoes or carrots or lettuce leaves that are, old or gone bad. If she would put those in a container and let them decompose a little bit, and then she could spread them on her plants, that will improve the humus layer or the topsoil layer of the soil, and then the plants will grow better. Okay, in that topsoil region, there are lots and lots of tiny little microorganisms, specifically bacteria. And there's also a lot of fungi and algae and protists. And then there are insects and earthworms and nematodes, which are just kinds of worms. And all of these things help to improve the soil layer, not just because when their bodies die, they decompose, but they also help to move the nutrients around and cycle the nutrients around, because they're always moving in and out of the soil, creating tunnels and passageways and their homes pretty much. So that allows the soil to get air. It's called aerating the soil, but it also turns all of the material over so that the nutrients are dispersed evenly throughout that topsoil layer. So when it comes to moving things around in plants, the three major players will be water and minerals, sugars, and gas exchange. Those are the main things that have to move in, out, up, and down your plant. So starting with water and minerals, you know that the water is transported by the vascular tissue, also called the xylem, and through transpiration, water is going to leave the plant through its leaves. So water is constantly moving up and out. Like if you look at this picture right here, the water showed in blue. Water always moves out of the soil into the roots, from the roots up through the xylem, into the stems and leaves, and then out of the leaves, and then it cycles back. So water only moves in one direction in your plant. Sugars, which are the food, okay, so the carbs, the glucose that your plant's leaves can make, also move in one direction. But they start off in the leaves, because that's the site of photosynthesis, and they get moved down throughout the plant until eventually they're in the roots, where sometimes they get stored. Gas exchange happens in both directions, but with two different gases. Carbon dioxide is always being pulled in so that we can do photosynthesis, and a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, which is leaving the leaf. Okay, so carbon dioxide in, oxygen out, and that happens in the leaf. Now, oxygen can also enter through the roots. Sometimes oxygen is dissolved into the water, and as the roots pick up the water, it picks up the dissolved oxygen as well. The minerals that we talked about, they're also going to enter from the root system, so they're colored in brown. So if you look here, that showcases your minerals moving into your roots as well. So water moves in mainly because the roots can absorb them, but the pull happens through transpiration. It moves up the tree and up the system through transpiration, and that's what we call a negative pressure. Now I'm going to explain what that means a little bit later on. Sugars are made in the leaves and transported in the phloem vessels, so still part of the vascular tissue, but the part that transports water is called xylem, and the part that transports sugar is called phloem, and they move through bulk flow, which is positive pressure. So water is moving out through negative pressure, or up through negative pressure, and sugar is moving down through positive pressure. Gas exchange, like I said, happens both in the leaves and in the roots, mainly because of respiration and photosynthesis, and we have carbon dioxides coming in and oxygen molecules coming out. Right, so this slide just details a cross-section of the leaf. It shows what it would look like if you could cut the leaf like straight down the middle and kind of look at it. And here, these little holes right here, those represent your stomata. And here you can see your carbon dioxide going in, your oxygen coming out. The little blue arrows are supposed to represent water and water molecules. So you can see that the leaf is pretty much covered in water, or there's lots of water inside of it, and then you have the gases moving. We will explain exactly how this happens a little bit later on. So we know that water mainly comes in through the roots, but how? One main process, the process of osmosis. But they're going to literally go from the soil, the spaces within the soil, into the cells that make up the roots. So how are they getting into the cells? Well, they're getting into the cells through osmosis. Hopefully you remember that osmosis is the process of moving water molecules from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration against a semi-permeable membrane. The membrane in this case would be your cell membrane. Now, a lot of cells have devised specialized channels or proteins that only transport water, and those are called aquaporins. So right here, you can see aquaporin channels, and only water molecules can be transported there. Mineral absorption also happens in the roots, and it's a little bit more of an involved process. So it can happen through active transport, which is going to require energy, and it can also happen through proton pumps. As the pumps, which are just proteins, move hydrogen ions, they transport some other things with them. So let's look at it a little bit more in depth. So proton pumps are proteins or channels that actively transport hydrogen ions out of the cell. So they literally pick them up from the inside of the cell and scoot them across and drop them on the outside of the cell. it results in something called chemiosmosis, which is the movement of ions. Not the movement of chemicals, because I know it sounds like that, but it's actually the movement of ions. This movement is going to create what we call a hydrogen gradient, which just means that on one side of the cell, you're going to have a lot of hydrogen, and on the other side of that cell membrane, you're not going to have as much hydrogen, also known as higher concentration and lower concentration. This difference in concentration, or this difference in amounts, creates what we call a membrane potential. The membrane potential is just the difference in charge. So on one side it's going to be really positive, on the other side it might be really negative. And this causes cations to be taken up because of that difference in charge. So if you look at the picture, this is the proton pump here. It is pumping positives. The gradient has already been created. So see all these little plus signs? That just tells you that outside of the cell is a positive environment, whereas inside of the cell is a negative environment. Well, all living things like to be equal. They like to be in homeostasis or in equilibrium. So the cell is going to attempt to correct this overbalance of negative by bringing in some positive ions. In this case, they're pumping in potassium ions. There are other cases when your cell is trying to maintain the environment that it's currently in. So in that situation, they will do what's called co-transportation. So if you look at this picture right here, that shows co-transportation, where we're moving in two different ions simultaneously. We're moving in hydrogen ions, but at the same time, we're moving in an anion, in this case, NaO3. So a nitrate is being pumped into the cell so that that environment, that positive and negative environment, can be maintained. Okay, so now that we understand from a molecular perspective, how exactly does the water go through the root? Well, it has to get through the cell wall. And the cell wall is porous, which just means it has spaces. If you look at the diagram does a pretty good job of detailing how this works. So water is going to move from the space within the soil into the root hairs or root cells. This is a root hair. It's just a little extension off of a root. And there are two ways that water can get from that root hair into the actual xylem. Because remember, water is only transported in the xylem vessels. So the job of the root is to pick up as much water as possible and get that water into the xylem, and then transpiration takes care of the rest. So there are two routes or two pathways. The first one is called the apoplastic route, which is detailed out in pink. And then there is the symplastic route, which is detailed out in blue. So starting with the apoplastic route or the apoplastic pathway, the water goes in to the root hair and it stays in that space between the cell wall and the cell membrane. So if you look here, you can see that it's kind of in the middle of, let me draw an arrow for you real quick. It's kind of in the middle of this part right there, and then that part right there. So it's in the middle of your cell wall and your cell membrane. And it's going to stay there for pretty much the majority of its journey. So it just travels through that space in, all these different that little middle portion between the cell wall and the cell membrane, until it gets to this middle region of the cell, which is called the Casparian strip. Now the Casparian strip doesn't allow water through the space between the cell wall and the cell membrane anymore. So now your symplastic method has to switch a little bit. Instead of going through that space, it's now going to have to go straight through the middle of the cell. And that's what it does until it gets to the xylem vessels. With your symplastic pathway, it's a little bit different. Instead of traveling in that space between the cell membrane and the cell wall, the water just travels straight through the cytoplasm of the cell, so straight through the middle of the cell. It's kind of like straight line method. It's the shortest distance. So that happens all the way through until it is past the Casparian strip, and then it changes slightly into the apoplastic membrane, where it's going to go through some intercellular space right here between that cell membrane and that cell wall until it's in the xylem. So pretty much two methods. One method takes you in between the cell wall and the cell membrane until you get to the Casparian strip. One method takes you straight through the cell, through the cytoplasm until you get to the Casparian strip. So we just said that water is really moving by osmosis to get into these cells. And osmosis is all about going from where you have a lot of something, or a lot of water in this case, to where you have a little bit of water. So what's preventing the water from flowing backwards? Well, your plant has a region close to the center of its body called the endodermis. And the endodermis is a cell layer that surrounds all of your vascular tissue in the root. So again, don't forget those vascular tissues are going to be the xylem for water and the phloem for sugars. That cell layer is lined by an impermeable Casparian strip. Now the Casparian strip doesn't run through the center of the cell. It only appears where there is like a cell membrane and a cell wall. So it runs in the space between the cell membrane and the cell wall. So if you look at this picture, this purple section right here, that shows you where the Casparian strip is. Because it's impenetrable, it prevents water from going backwards through that space between the cell wall and the cell membrane. It can't really control the water that flows out through the actual cell, but that is to a minimum. That's not as much as the water that would come through this internal space. Okay, so this is just a classic example of how structure and function fit. We need you to do this certain job. We're going to design you so you can get that job accomplished. Alright, so this picture just shows, again, those two pathways that we talked about, and then the endodermis region with the Casparian strip and the xylem. So this gives you more of a holistic view where you can see almost the entire root, and then this one's just an up-close view of the endodermal cells and the Casparian strip. Okay, so the plant root is going to look different depending on whether we are talking about a dicot plant or a monocot plant. So your monocot plants are like your grasses, whereas your dicot plants are like the trees that you are familiar with, just regular trees and shrubs. This is what your dicot looks like. All of this is just generalized tissue. This region where there's that circle, that's where your xylem is found. So it makes this little like cross shape. Whereas on your monocot, it doesn't look like that. Again, here's your endodermis region, and all of this inside would be your xylem and your phloem. In an attempt to get even more water, a lot of plants form a specialized symbiotic relationship with a fungus called Mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae wraps itself gently around the roots of plants, and all that it does is it increases the volume that plant can reach. So it digs down deeper into the soil or across more into the soil, and it helps to increase how much water and minerals that plant is able to pick up because it increases the general surface area of the plant's roots. So here's an example of how this works. This is your actual root, and all of these little purple things that look kind of weird, that would be your Mycorrhizae fungus. So if you look at it, they've embedded themselves within the cells of the actual root. So when they pick up water, the water is transported straight into the cells, and then it just continues the journey from there. It's actually a really cool relationship. All right, so let's recap real quick. We know the water is moved out of the space pockets within the soil. It's moved through osmosis into the cells of the root. It can get into the xylem by two methods, either the apoplastic pathway or the symplastic pathway. The apoplastic pathway takes us through the space between the cell membrane and the cell wall, whereas the symplastic pathway takes us straight through the cytoplasm of the cell. Regardless of how you start the process, once you get to the Casparian strip, all the water has to move through the actual cytoplasm until they eventually get to the xylem vessels, because that Casparian strip is impermeable. It won't let water pass through that space between the cell wall and the cell membrane. So we now have water in the xylem. What next? How does it move? Well, roots experience pressure. Remember, pressure is just like a push, almost like a force. And it's caused by the distribution of nutrients and water molecules in the root of the xylem cells. The more water those roots take up, the higher the pressure increases. When the pressure gets really, really high, especially at night, some plants can't hold on to all of the liquid inside of them, and they release some of it through a process called guttation. So If you ever see leaves that have little beads of water just on the edge of the leaf, that's not dew. That's actually xylem sap, a mixture of water and nutrients. And it's the process of them doing that is called guttation. And it's just that the pressure increases so much that the water or the water mix is forced out of these little pores within the leaf, and they just kind of sit there until they're disturbed. So root pressure is a force that is going to push water up the stem. And for a small plant, that's enough. You have enough pressure that the water is being forced through those xylem vessels, up through the little stems and into the leaves where they're needed and can be utilized. But when we're talking about really big trees like giant sequoia redwood trees in California, then this little bit of root pressure is not going to be enough to get your water all the way up. So what happens? The plant has water. It needs to have water. How are we going to get it from the roots way down in the soil up into the leaves, which in some trees can be as high as 60 or 70 stories? Well, to work it out, we apply some TACT. TACT stands for tension, adhesion, cohesion, transpiration theory. So tension is based on the fact that water is a polar molecule. And polar just means that it's slightly positive on one end and slightly negative on the other end. So it exhibits an attractive force. Think of like a magnet. Hopefully you remember this from chemistry. Because of this polarity, this slight positive and slight negative, water is able to form a type of bond called a hydrogen bond between its molecules. This hydrogen bond formation, this ability of water molecules to link to each other, gives water special properties like surface tension. So that's why some types of insects and even lizards can walk on water or run on water. It's because the water has created this mat. They're all linked together, and if you spread out your weight enough or you're small enough, you can literally walk on top of the molecules. So not only does this tension ability or this bonding ability allow water to hold animals up or insects up, but it also allows plants to draw water up from their roots to their leaves. It's all because those molecules can hook onto each other. They can bond to each other. So think of it as us linking arms with every single person in our classroom. Adhesion is when water molecules form hydrogen bonds, not with themselves, but this time with what they're being held in. So in the case of the plant, they're being held inside of a xylem vessel. So they're going to bond not just with the other water molecules next to them, but they're also going to bond with the cell walls that make up that xylem vessel. Cohesion is when water molecules, like we said, they bond with each other, so they're all linked together. Transpiration is water lost through the leaves. So it's a really hot day, the stomata are open, water molecules evaporate out. But remember, let's think of all of the properties that we've just learned about. We know water forms polar bonds, or we know water is polar, it can form hydrogen bonds, which means that all the water molecules are linked to each other, but they can also link to the size of the container that they're in. So if I remove one water molecule, because that water molecule is linked to another, which is linked to another, to another, to another, to another, me pulling that one molecule out pulls on the entire set of them, and they all move. So I ask you to link arms in the classroom, and then you link your arms to mine, and I stand by M2's classroom door, and I step out into the area of the hallway. A bunch of you are going to step out with me because you're all linked to me. Everyone is going to move because we're linked together. That's how water moves up a tree, regardless of how tall that tree is. It's important to note that water can only move all the way up the tree due to a combination of all of the processes we just talked about: TACT, tension, adhesion, cohesion, transpiration. If we're missing any of those, the process doesn't work. So here's an example, like a picture version of what I was talking about. So tension in the water column is due to your pull and transpiration. It's holding everything in place. Your water molecules, if we zoom in, you can see that they've all formed polar bonds with each other. They're all linked together. But they've also formed polar bonds with the cell wall, which allows them to be linked to the wall. Which is why when you pour water into like a graduated cylinder, for example, you know how the top of it never forms a straight line? It always looks like a curve. It's because those water molecules on the edge are kind of like clinging to the surface of that graduated cylinder. So it's the same process here. Now, if I were to exhibit transpiration and pull on this molecule, then all of them would move in that direction. Now, of course, we make it sound all nice and neat, where, you know, the water's just going to, by osmosis, move into the roots, and then some sun's going to shine, and some water's going to evaporate from the leaves, and everything's going to move up because they're all connected, and they're connected to what they're in, and they're connected to each other. It's real simple. But it really isn't that simple. So, of course, you know I have to throw some math at you. This is where the math in plants come in. Something called water potential. And water potential is the potential of water to move into any given space. So water potential is one of the calculations you're going to have to know how to do. It is a number, and it's pretty much the tendency of free water to move from an area or from different areas due to different processes, things like osmosis or gravity or pressure. Now, when we say free water means, I'm going to try and write in my car, wish me luck. Free water means that the water molecules are not bonded. Okay, this is harder than I thought. Oops. Let's try that again. Okay, so these water molecules are not bonded to anything else. They are expressed in potential energy per unit volume, and they're represented by the Greek letter psi. And that letter always looks like a trident. So I think of like King Trident from The Little Mermaid, the little trident that he held, or the big trident that he held. To me, that's what that letter looks like. And it's pronounced psi, the same way you would sigh because this video is so long. Water potential can be altered or changed based on different scenarios or circumstances. So when you add solutes to water, it lowers the water potential. If I threw a handful of salt into a glass of water, I just lowered the water potential of that glass of water. Because by me throwing in a solute, I'm going to break that water molecule up because I'm going to force it to dissolve or to try to dissolve whatever I've just placed in it. And now my water molecules aren't free anymore. They are connected or bonded to something else. Increasing pressure in the area or the container that the water is in will increase water potential. It makes it more positive. It increases the chances that the water will move because I am applying a force. I am pushing it in a direction. Free water moves from regions of higher water potential to regions of lower water potential if there is no barrier to its flow. I want you to think of this as the grown-up version of our definition for osmosis. So we always told you it's the movement of water from higher concentration to lower concentration, and it is, but at the AP level, we think of it in terms of water potential. So regions of higher water potential, where it's easier to move, to regions of lower water potential, not as easy to move. Potential refers to the water's potential energy, which is pretty much that water's capacity or ability to perform work. In this case, the work is going to be the movement. So there is an equation for calculating water potential, and it says that psi is equal to the solute potential plus the pressure potential. So water potential psi is equal to the solute potential plus the pressure potential. So again, I have designated what all of these little symbols mean for you. So psi is water potential, psi sub s is solute potential, and solute potential is directly proportional to molarity, how much of something is dissolved into something else. And it can sometimes be called osmotic potential, but it's the same thing. So osmotic potential, solute potential, same thing. And then, this should say psi sub p, not psi sub s. So let's cross out the s here and make it a p. So psi sub p, oh wait, no, I'm sorry. I just completely messed that up. Ignore everything I just said about this right here. Let me erase that. I think I put it in the wrong spot. I can't find my eraser. This is awesome. There we go. Now I can't erase. I swear I can't screw this up anymore, guys. I'm sorry. Hold on a second. Bear with me. Okay, I fixed it. It only took me like 3 seconds. But anyway, so psi sub S, the psi sub S of pure water is 0. So the solute potential of pure water is 0. That makes sense. Pure water means that there's nothing dissolved in it. There is no solute. So of course it's 0. Now psi sub P is pressure potential. How much push are you exerting on that container? Now at some point, hopefully in freshman biology, you should have learned that xylem cells are actually dead. They're non-living. And that makes them hollow, which makes them the perfect thing to transport water back and forth because they're like these gigantic straws that are running through your entire plant. So water in a non-living hollow xylem cell is under a negative pressure. That pressure is, a negative potential. That potential, also known as tension, is less than negative 2 MPAs. MPa is just the unit that we use for potential. But the water in a living cell is usually under positive pressure, and this is due to the osmotic uptake of water. So if you think about it, a non-living cell has nothing in it other than the water that's in. So the little bit of pressure that it's exhibiting or it's experiencing is just coming from the walls of those xylem vessels. Whereas in a living cell, we have all these parts and pieces. We have things like the vacuole that takes up water, the cytoplasm, and all of the different organelles that all exert a pressure. And then, of course, we are still taking in more water that's increasing the pressure in that cell. I love this picture because it brings everything that we've been talking about kind of into perspective a little bit. And it gives you a visual to go with these images. Now, you might recognize these YouTubes from stuff that you did in freshman biology, but we're just going to take it a step further. So I told you a couple slides ago that when you add solutes to water, you're actually going to lower the water potential of that body of water. So solutes have a negative effect on water potential, and it's because they will bind to water molecules. Water is the universal solvent, as you've probably already been told, which just means that it has the ability to bond with a lot of things and pretty much pull them apart and dissolve them. That's what dissolving is. Water molecules are going to attract the parts that are positive and the parts that are negative, surrounds them, and keep them from coming back together. But they themselves, the water molecules themselves, are now in a bond with whatever that ion is. So if I have this YouTube, it's filled to the same level with water. Well, okay, so obviously my drawing skills aren't that great. But tell me something I don't already know. So it's filled to the same level with water. If I add solutes to one end, so let's say to this right end, this right arm, I'm going to add solutes there. If I go ahead and do that, it's going to lower the water potential in this region. So right here, I have lowered water potential. Okay? Now, that is going to result in a net movement of water to this side of the U-tube. So water is actually going to move from this U-tube, or this arm of the U-tube, to that arm of the U-tube. Because remember, it's all about water potential. Water is going to move from a higher water potential. This end is going to be higher because there is nothing holding onto those water molecules, and it's going to move to a lower water potential, this end, which is lower because these water molecules are now in bonds with these solute particles that have been dropped in. Now, let's look at the effect that pressure has on water potential. So positive pressure has a positive effect on water potential, and it's because you're applying a force. You are pushing that water in a certain direction. So if I apply positive pressure to the right side, it seems like we're doing everything to the right side here, but if I apply positive pressure to the right side, it's going to make the water potential here higher because I am forcing it to move in a certain direction. So I'm going to end up with movement to the left, and the water on the left side of my tube is going to rise. It's going to appear like it's increasing, but that's because I am pushing on it from this end. So what happens if we put both of them together because they have opposing effects on water. Solutes have a negative effect, whereas positive pressure has a positive effect. So if I apply solutes and I apply positive pressure to this arm, what's going to happen? Well, nothing happens. There's no net movement of water because they cancel each other out. Now, what about negative pressure? Negative pressure isn't so much a push or a pull as it's just tension, like the tension we talked about in the TAC. So negative pressure has a negative effect on water, and that's because you are pulling it. Positive means I'm pushing it in a certain direction, whereas negative pressure means I'm pulling it in the opposite direction. So if I were to apply negative pressure again to my right arm, but this time instead of pushing, I would be pulling it up. Applying negative pressure here is going to lower the water potential on the right side, which is going to make water move in from the left side because, again, water moves from higher water potential to lower water potential, and I'm going to have an increase on this side. My water level is going to go up. All right, so I really like this picture because to me it helps to put everything in perspective, so I hope this was helpful for you. Alright, so this picture really puts everything into perspective, and at some point I'm going to expect you to be able to do what I'm about to do in relation to this picture. So starting off with the movement of water, let's start off in the roots. So we know that water molecules, or water in general, exist in air pockets or spaces in between soil particles. If you look at this picture, all the brown, that would be your soil particles, and all the blue represents the water. We know that as a way to increase surface area and increase how many water molecules a plant can take up, it's going to have a really vast root system, depending on the size of the plant, but those roots are also going to have root hairs. We also know that some plants even go so far as to form a symbiotic relationship with a fungus to even more increase the surface area that their root system is able to cover. So, water is going to move into the root hairs and through the cells until it gets to the xylem vessel, which runs in the middle of that tree or that plant. And this is done by osmosis, movement of water from higher concentration, which in this case would be outside of the root, to lower concentration, in this case, inside the root. We know that there are two pathways that water can take. It can go through the apoplastic pathway, where the water is literally running through the space between the cell wall and the cell membrane. Or it can go through the symplastic pathway, where the water runs straight through the cell, like straight through the cytoplasm and everything. Once the water gets into the xylem, which is the vascular tissue that is going to transport it upwards to the plant, some of the generic and wonderful properties of water starts to take place. Things like adhesion and cohesion, where water is, because it's a polar molecule, it forms hydrogen bonds with itself, which is cohesion, and also hydrogen bonds with any container that it is currently in this case the xylem, or adhesion. We know that because all of the water molecules are linked together, when we start the process of transpiration in the leaves, when one water molecule evaporates out of the stomata in the leaves, it is going to cause a pulling action on every single water molecule linked to the one that just evaporated. This pulling motion is going to move the water in the xylem all the way up until they get to the leaves, and that is going to create a situation where, once more, we have regions of higher concentration being outside and lower concentrations being inside, and water will move back in, and the process will repeat itself. That's it from a non-water potential perspective. Now, if we think about it from a water potential perspective, here's what I need you to remember. Water potential is the greatest at the bottom part of your plant, in that root system, in the soil. Water potential is the biggest it can be at this point. As you move upwards, the water potential gradient is going to change. You're going to get less and less water potential as we move up towards those leaves. So we know that the grown-up version is that water is going to move from regions of high water potential to regions of low water potential. High water potential is in the roots, low water potential is in the leaves. Water will move upwards. When you sit down and really think about it, all of this process, this whole process is being regulated by the stomata in those leaves. They regulate transpiration, and it's because they're the parts, the actual holes or the openings in the leaf that can open and close. So how do they open? Well, they open because, now here's something I need you to understand. When you look at this picture, I need you to know that this space right here, that is your stomata. The stomata is the actual opening. Now around that opening we have these C-shaped cells, kind of like bean-shaped cells. Those are called guard cells. So when water moves into the guard cells from other parts of the leaf via osmosis, it causes the cells to become turgid because you're filling them up. I want you to think of filling a water balloon. The water balloon starts expanding. Well, these cells do the exact same thing. When they expand, they start bowing or bowing, however you want to say that. And they do it outward, kind of in this region here and this region here. That bowing action of the guard cells, or bowing action of the guard cells, increases the size of this opening or stomata. So when there's lots of water in these guard cells, the stomata open up and gas exchange happens. So this is the cartoon version, and then right here, this is the real version of a stomata. So again, the stomata is the opening in the center, and these C-shaped or bean-shaped cells are called guard cells. So if that's how they open, then they do the opposite to close. When guard cells lose water because the plant's not picking up enough water and the water is needed elsewhere or too much evaporation is taking place, then they kind of shrivel up and they become flaccid, they become limp. So think of pouring water out of your water balloon. It's not as turgid, it's not as hard or sturdy as it used to be. Once they start losing water, they're going to become less bowed, and instead of pushing out, they're almost going to push in, and this causes the pore to close, or the stomata to close. So like here, it looks a lot smaller than it did in the previous picture. So this is going to limit gas exchange. Right now, you know, we're closed down, we're shut, not open for business, nothing's coming in and out. On the previous picture where there was an actual space right here, we were open for business, gases were coming in and out. So along with just the water molecules coming in and out, there are other ions, one in particular that does have a role in the opening and closing of a stomata, and that ion would be potassium. So potassium ions get transported across the cell membrane of the guard cells, and transporting those ions changes the pressure inside of the guard cells. So when the stomata open, we tend to notice that it's because guard cells have accumulated potassium ions, which lowers their water potential. So I just realized that I missed out a word. So it should say, stomata open when guard cells accumulate potassium ions. Okay, so when you accumulate an ion is a solute. Well, you've just binded up your free water, or bound up, maybe binded isn't the word, but you've bound up your free water with these potassium ions. You've lowered their water potential, which means that you are creating a situation where more and more water is going to enter the cell, like these arrows show, and that cell is going to swell, and you're going to open up the stomata. Now, when stomata close, it's because these same potassium ions have been removed from the guard cells. Well, you have just again changed the water potential. By losing the potassium ions, which by the way in these diagrams are these red dots, but by losing the potassium ions or having them on the outside of the guard cells, you just increase the water potential here, so chances are instead of water coming in, water is actually going to go out. Because don't forget, when it comes to water potential, water moves from regions of high water potential to regions of low water potential. We've talked a good deal about water and how water moves around, but we know that's not the only thing that's important for the life and health of a plant. Food is definitely going to be really high ranking up there, and plants are kind of known for the ability, or their ability, to produce their own food with certain raw materials available. So that food is going to be in the form of sucrose, which is a sugar, and sugars in your plant cells, or in your plant period, is transported by phloem vessels. So another part of your vascular tissue, but this is the one that transports sugars. So we say that sucrose gets loaded into the phloem because they are created, the sucrose that is created in the leaves, and it needs to travel throughout the plant so that all cells have usable and viable food source. They flow through the cells, so from the cells, because they are made in the chloroplast, so they have to kind of exit the chloroplast and then exit the cell and then get into the phloem. And they move from cell to cell through cell connections that plants have called plasmodesmata. So if you look at this picture, do you see where it has these little channels? I'm going to try to highlight that for you. So here be one set of channels, here's another, another, and another. Those are your plasmodesmata. They link series of plant cells together. So it's like an open connection. Think of it as a revolving door. So that's one way that your sucrose is going to get into your phloem. Another way is through proton pumps. There is going to be some co-transportation of sucrose into cells, creating a proton gradient, just like we did for water and ions. So if you look at this picture here, you can see that when we move hydrogen in the cell, we also move sucrose in at the same time. So it's a co-transporter because both things are moving in the same direction. Just like with water, there is an apoplastic transport system, and there is a symplastic transport system, and they work in pretty much the same way. Apoplastic goes through the space between the cell membrane and the cell wall, whereas symplastic goes straight through the actual cell. The movement of sugars in your phloem are very much dependent on what we call pressure flow. This can also be called mass flow, and another term for it is bulk flow, but they all refer to the way that sucrose gets moved around in the phloem. It flows in what we call a source to sink direction. So source being the leaf and sink being any place else that needs sugar at that point in time. So source to sink again is just the direction of transport in phloem, and it's dependent on the plant's needs. The source is always going to be the leaves, but the sink can be various places. It could be a stem, it could be a root, it just depends. It's wherever that plant needs that sugar at that point in time. So we have a process that's called phloem loading. It's how the sucrose gets into the phloem, just like how we have a process where water gets into the xylem. So we kind of talked about this before, but just to rehash, it's done through a combination of active transport of sucrose, so we're actively pumping sucrose into the phloem vessels, kind of like when we pull in a hydrogen, we pull in a sucrose molecule as well. And it's also done because of a change in concentration gradient. You change the amount of sucrose you have available, and it's going to move. Now, don't forget, your sucrose is going to be considered a solute. So when you increase the sucrose concentration in the phloem, you're going to decrease the water potential, and you get movement in that way. Because again, don't forget, when you lower water potential, water is always going to move from high to low. So the water is going to move out of the xylem into the phloem, dissolve the sugar a little bit, and then it gets transported down. It flows down via pressure and need. So where does the name pressure flow come from? Well, the name pressure flow comes actually from the pressure created by the water as it moves in from the xylem. As it starts traveling down, it is increasing the pressure, and that is forcing the phloem to move downward. So while we're on the topic of nutrition, it doesn't really terribly coexist, but we could kind of tie it in. Let's talk about some of the adaptations and some of the changes that plants would have had to have gone through, some of the natural selection that plants would have had to have gone through to actually make it in the arid environment known as land. So plants that have adapted to arid environments, arid just in this case, really just meaning dry, they have the following leaf adaptation. So you got to think of it as this way. It's a really dry situation, probably not a lot of rainfall, probably not a lot of underground water storage. So some adaptations are going to be key for plants to survive in these kinds of environments. The first thing you're going to need are leaves that are thick and fairly hard, not very flexible leaves, and they need to have as few stomata as possible. It's always going to be best if those stomata are placed only on the underside of the leaf and not on both the top and the underside. Most plants have stomata on both ends, But if you're trying to conserve water, you want very little stomata, and you want them only on the underneath portion of your leaf. You want leaves that have some kind of covering on them, and the plant answer to this covering are called trichomes. Trichomes are these little tiny hairs which reflect more light, and thus it reduces the rate of transpiration. You also want leaves with stomata that are located in what we call surface pits. So surface pits are little depressions within the leaf that the stomata sits inside of. And this is going to increase your water tension, and it's also going to reduce the rate of transpiration, just because of the location. Okay, that last one got cut off, but it should say you would like leaves that are spine-like with stems that carry out photosynthesis. So again, that last one that got cut off should say leaves that are spine-like with stems that carry out photosynthesis. So hopefully the plants that I've been describing kind of sound familiar. What comes to mind should be things like cactus, for example. Really good adaptations for that dry environment. Now, there are situations where it's the opposite. Sometimes plants have to experience prolonged areas of water, lots of flooding, for example. And that is going to create situations in plants that are not adapted for that kind of environment. Things like if you keep your roots underwater, you're not going to be able to get oxygen that those cells are going to need for cellular respiration and for the synthesis of ATP. Because you don't have energy, because you can't get oxygen, then the leaves that the plant does possess, they may dry out, and that's going to cause the plant to die because there's nothing that the plant can now use as the site of photosynthesis. Additionally, any kind of hormones that would normally take care of you replacing roots that are lost or damaged, that's going to be completely suppressed because they're going to be coming from those root systems, and that root system no longer exists, it's dead, so you're not going to have that hormonal balance anymore. So to avoid all of the nastiness that I just spoke about, plants do have certain and special adaptations for a water environment. So they will be the following. Things like large lenticels or pores that are on the stem so that you have multiple places that you can get oxygen from, not just from your roots. The formation of adventitious roots. So these are roots that kind of grow out of like node regions of the plant, so where the stem and the branches, for lack of a better term, meet. And they tend to be roots that exist in the actual air and not in the water. So they grow at a site away from where we normally think of roots growing. And that again is to increase gas exchange. We can have formation of stomata that are only on the surface of the leaf. So water lilies do this a lot. They only have stomata on the top because that's the best place for them. That's where oxygen can easily be exchanged and carbon dioxide as well. Formation of a layer of air-filled chambers for gas exchange, and that allows gases to move between the plant above the water and within the submerged tissues as well. So the gases can kind of travel to the parts that are not underwater, but they can also travel to the parts that are underwater. All right, and then one of the last adaptations would be adaptations to saline environments. Saline just meaning salty. So soil salinity is actually a problem. It's an increasing factor in our world today, especially because of the fertilizers we use and just some of our household products that we tend to throw away. It's just increasing how much salt is in the soil. Many plants can be killed if they are exposed to too much salt, but some plants have adapted to growing in saline conditions, and these are called halophytes. They have spongy leaves, so these are their adaptations. They have spongy leaves that actually store water, and that water is used to dilute the salt that the roots will pick up. So they just walk around with extra water pouches just for the purpose of diluting salt. They actively transport the salt out of the root. So just like how we use the proton pump and we pumped in hydrogen and minerals or hydrogen and sucrose, they use a proton pump and they pump out something plus salt. Or some of them can even block the salt completely so that it can't enter the roots. They produce high concentrations of organic molecules in the roots to alter water potential. So they may not absorb as much water from their root system because they're probably increasing the water potential in their root system, but they're going to get their water some other way. All right, so this is it. I hope it wasn't too painful. At some point I'm going to load a video going over how to do water potential questions, just so you have that for access as well, but we'll talk about it in class on Thursday. And I'll see you guys on Thursday. Bye!